dealing with. Which is why the FDA has taken a number of significant steps since the heparin contamination crisis to safeguard the U.S. supply of this medically necessary drug and to prevent similar situations from unfolding in the future. We worked hard to help identify and characterize the nature of the heparin adulterant and the appropriate testing methodologies to determine its presence in the heparin product. Importantly, the United States Pharmacopoeia also now calls for testing to detect whether the contaminant that sickened patients in 2008, oversulfated chondroitin sulfate, is present in heparin. And of course, we've invested considerable resources in inspecting heparin manufacturing and testing facilities related to the supply of heparin in the United States to determine if the heparin was manufactured in accordance with good manufacturing practice requirements. Overall, FDA's inspectional approach has focused on traceability, testing, verification of controls, and supplier qualification related to crude heparin so that contamination from crude heparin would be prevented, detected, and addressed. And our efforts have not stopped there. We're committed to putting preventive measures in place that will protect American consumers from economically motivated adulteration of all imported drugs. The lessons FDA learned as a result of the heparin adulteration emergency have been more broadly applied toward a strategy capable of identifying and safeguarding other drugs, which may become targets for adulteration. In order to further this effort, FDA is developing risk models to help us identify drugs and ingredients at risk of an economically motivated adulteration. This will enable us to target our resources in critical ways. We combine risk-based approaches with sound scientific evidence to protect the public from adulterated drugs and take a number of factors into account in determining whether a particular drug ingredient may be at risk for adulteration. For example, when a drug ingredient depends on raw materials that are particularly expensive, criminals may have an extra incentive to find cheaper alternatives to the more expensive ingredient. And if the cheaper alternative can actually mimic the chemical activity of the active ingredient, which is what we saw with the case of heparin and also the use of melamine as an adulterant in dairy products and in pet food, the risk of adulteration is, of course, even higher. To date, the FDA has systematically ranked more than 1,000 active pharmaceutical ingredients in order of their respective risk of economically motivated adulteration, based on a multifactorial risk-based model that we developed. A subset of these high-risk ingredients is targeted for additional sampling and testing at the border. In addition, FDA is working to reduce the risk that counterfeit or adulterated drug products reach consumers in the United States market by developing standards for track and trace systems that enable the identification of these products and facilitate our efforts to recall them. I also want to underscore that threats to compromise drug integrity and supply chain security is a global problem whereby FDA cannot work in a vacuum to curtail these threats. To a large extent, our success or failure in this effort will depend on the relationships that we establish and maintain with our foreign partners. That is why we're working closely with our sister regulatory authorities around the world on a bilateral and multilateral basis with international and national organizations such as the World Health Organization and the Permanent Forum on International Pharmaceutical Crime, and with industry to leverage international resources to combat counterfeits. We also share scientific and technical expertise with our fellow regulators, provide training around the world in crucial regulatory disciplines, strengthen detection, surveillance, and assessment systems, and design innovative new information systems. To foster these efforts, FDA has recently established overseas posts in many parts of the world, including China, India, Europe, and Latin America, and we're doing so now in the Middle East as well. When governments collaborate to strengthen safety and security standards, the results support safe, quality products and economic development through productive industry and a strong, reliable export market. The arrangement, I think, is a win-win for us all. In addition, FDA is working to reduce the risk that counterfeit or other adulterated drug products pose to consumers here in the U.S. by developing standards for track and trace and authentication systems that, when implemented, will provide greater transparency and accountability of our nation's drug supply and facilitate our efforts to recall these substandard drugs. Earlier this year, FDA established a standard for unique identifiers for packagers of drugs. This standard creates a license plate for individual packages of drug products as they travel through the supply chain. This is an important first step in developing a track and trace system and authentication system in the United States. The FDA is firmly committed to doing all that we can do to further strengthen our nation's drug supply and ensure the quality and safety of all drugs and medical products here on the U.S. market. To achieve this, the agency is organizing these efforts into a new Drug Integrity and Security Program based in the Office of Compliance in FDA's Centers for Drug Evaluation and Research, which will specifically focus on issues such as counterfeiting, economically motivated adulteration, diversion, cargo theft, and other supply chain threats. This program will take a life cycle approach by identifying vulnerabilities for products in the supply chain, starting with the raw ingredients, continuing through to when the finished product actually reaches the patient, and working with stakeholders to put measures in place to mitigate these threats and vulnerabilities. The program is just getting off the ground, but we expect that as it grows, we'll be able to focus greater and additional efforts on drug integrity and security, and then we can advance the ball domestically and internationally to protect our nation's drug supply and that of all nations. FDA is also reconstituting our internal counterfeit working group, which will help us to better coordinate our anti-counterfeiting efforts across the agency. It's also clear that the agency needs new regulatory tools that provide the authority we need to meet the challenges we face in today's increasingly globalized marketplace. And we look forward to working with Congress on legislation that will give the FDA the ability to protect Americans from harmful drugs and medical products and fulfill our fundamental mission to protect the health of the public. So I'd like to close this afternoon by thanking all of you for the work that you do in so many different ways to support the important challenges raised by the efforts of counterfeit drugs and our need to combat them, and to support the importance of public health. And I want to return to a recognition of FDA's history, where I began. I mentioned how President Roosevelt had had an important role in the creation of the so-called modern FDA back in the 1930s. Well, another President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, actually signed the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, which planted the seeds for what would eventually formally become the FDA. And he has a quote that I think is quite apt for the discussions today. He said, "In a moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The worst thing you can do is nothing." We all play an important role in addressing these challenges. And if we keep this in mind, that we must use all the tools at our disposal to do the right thing, I'm confident that we can, and we will succeed in protecting the health and safety of the American people and people all over the world. So thank you for your time and attention and for all the hard work that you do. I can take some questions.
So the commissioners are gracious enough to offer some time for questions. We just ask that everyone could identify yourself and the organization you're with, and then you can provide the question.
You may be too worn out after the whole day.
It's a long day.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Cesar Arias, Stone Cold Investigations. When is the FDA going to enforce the PDMA provision of the pedigree?
First, I have to comment, the name of your organization is very impressive, Stone Cold Investigations. You know, I can't give you a specific answer to that question, but what I can tell you is that we are deeply committed to strengthening our activities on many levels to address the problem of counterfeits. Active enforcement is an enormously important part of that activity, as well as the efforts to really look at how to shore up the safety of the supply chain at every step along the way. I do believe that we need to do more in terms of the track and trace capabilities. We need to do more in terms of supporting issues around pedigree. And I think that we can do more with existing authorities. I think it's also important, as I mentioned, to really look, especially in a global world, at the need for some additional authorities and clear explication in the law about important aspects of this agenda. So what I can tell you is that we are really very, very committed to this area of work. I believe that this is a critical moment in time to roll up our sleeves and do everything that we can, and to do it in partnership with other components of government, with the private sector, and importantly, with our partners in the law enforcement community.